Now we got the mic. Great. Thank you.
But I know there are a lot of people involved, but that's
All right,
great.
let's begin. Thank you all for coming. This afternoon's panel is entitled States, Underappreciated Labs of Democracy, and this is panel 1912. I'm Paul Shankman, your moderator for the afternoon, and I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. We do have one panelist who couldn't make it, Ellie Boldman-Hill, but we do have three exceptional panelists, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. So our first panelist is Frank Shafroth, and he is not an elected official. We actually had 3 elected officials among the other panelists. He's an attorney. He's worked extensively on Capitol Hill, working on municipal issues and urban problems, and he's currently teaching a course on leadership at George Mason University. Our second panelist is Marilinda Garcia, and she was elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives at age 23.
Long time ago, though.
I believe I believe you
At least
served
2 years.
4 terms?
Yes, I served.
Okay. She's been a healthcare advocate. She's also been a cultural ambassador for Youth Orchestra of the Americas and is widely traveled. Our third panelist is Robert Inglis, and he was elected to the he was elected to the U.S. Congress in the 1990s from South Carolina. He's been an advocate for accountable free enterprise and has worked extensively on climate change. Robert married his college sweetheart and has 5 adult children. You can see their full biographies in your conference program. So these are our panelists, and now let me say a little bit about the format. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then panelists will have an opportunity, if they wish to do so, to ask each other questions for a short period of time, and then we will turn to your questions. Now, there is a new format, and we're using it in just 2 venues because it's an experimental format. So one way that you can submit questions is by text, and that's because this event is being live streamed, so people streaming can actually text in their questions, and let me tell you how to do that using official language. Audience questions for this panel can be submitted via text. This trial format is motivated by a desire to allow our online audience to participate in the Q&A period and by a desire to improve the overall quality of the Q&A period at the conference. To participate in the text question submission, you first need to join this session. In fact, if you think you might want to ask a question in this session, I'd encourage you to take out your cell phone now. Actually, you can use your cell phones now. And to join this session, send a text message to this number, 22333. This number is illustrated on posters on each side of the stage. In the body of the message, you'll type in the keyword UMCGMB. You'll get a confirmation message that you are now part of the session. Just reply to that message with your question for the panel, and that's supposed to pop up on our tablet right here. Don't forget that at the conclusion of the panel, if you've registered to text a question, then you should text the word leave at the end of the session. So that's one way to ask a question. The other way is the good old-fashioned way. We have a microphone. Just step up to the mic Students have priority, but we'll have fun with your questions. So with all of that said, let's begin with our panelists. Frank, you're up.
Thank you. I think this is going to be perhaps one of the most important years for states in the history of the United States. So that's why there's so many people here this afternoon. I say this because huge questions are coming up, and they're going to be defined to some extent over the next 12 days. 12 days from now, Puerto Rico is likely to default on a debt payment it owes. If it defaults, it will be bankrupt. So one of the issues confronting the White House, confronting the House and Senate, even though they're on recess, is Puerto Rico a state, or is it a territory? So this whole issue of defining under the Constitution what a state is. It's an issue also where arguments have been made in the past month before the United States Supreme Court, so we can anticipate a Supreme Court question coming out, or answer coming out, although given the court it might be 4-4, we don't know, but it will look to how we define, how the founding fathers, who represented states, because remember, in the United States, unlike any other country in the world, states created the federal government, not vice versa. So it's a very unique system of dual sovereignty that doesn't exist anywhere else. States also are in the middle of dealing with some profound questions about federalism. The largest and fastest growing kind of government we have in the United States of America are called special purpose governments. It can be water districts, sewer districts, fire districts. There are more of those than cities and counties combined in the United States. The Internal Revenue Service has put out a ruling that would define what could be defined by a state legislature and a governor as a special purpose district eligible to issue municipal tax exempt debt. So we have a big legal and constitutional issue pending. We have one special district in Texas that has one person. We have some special districts created by state legislatures that are larger than any city or county in the state. So each of the 50 states have defined a different way to define what a special district is, and now the Internal Revenue Service has said, we don't really care what you've done because we have a different way. So that's a test to be decided that will be an essential test of federalism. We have another issue. It's an issue important to parts of Colorado. I would really say northeast Colorado. Can a state cause a local government to die? At what point does a local government get so small, a state, a legislature, not in New Hampshire, of course, but other states, determine we're going to make that local government go out of existence and be swallowed by another local government? So I think we have some fundamental questions that will challenge some of our thinking about what the role of states is. Now, I also want you to think as this question of how is Congress going to deal with this looming insolvency for Puerto Rico? How is the Supreme Court going to deal with defining Puerto Rico? I want to take you back in time. We're going to be in a little vehicle to go back to February 10th, 1917. That's before you were born, you know. And a fellow by the name of John F. Shafroth, having served as governor of Colorado, now a member of the United States Senate, during the debate on the floor of the United States Senate with regard to whether Puerto Rico should become a state, and managing the debate on the floor of the Senate, said, always stood, Carly, in my territory of New Mexico during the last 30-odd years in my experience in the local legislatures there, and insofar as possible for me to do so in the Constitutional Convention in favor of securing a proper constitution for these people when they came into the Union. And I stand here in exactly that attitude towards the people of Puerto Rico. So a critical part of the challenge facing Congress and the Treasury is the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which explicitly set forth this country's constitutional principle of federalism as defined by the Founding Fathers. Sorry, ladies, we only had Founding Fathers, no Founding Mothers. Meeting in Philadelphia. And that states that the powers not granted to the federal government nor prohibited to the states by the Constitution are reserved to the states. So that's the part I was talking about. It doesn't exist in any other country in the world. States have this unique but undefined power that the Supreme Court will come in from time to time and define. It doesn't really define what a state is, so now we have the Supreme Court and the Congress trying to figure out what exactly is Puerto Rico, what are we going to make Puerto Rico, and we have until April 17th to make some hard decisions about what happens to Puerto Rico. So you're at a time and on an issue that's as fundamental as anything the Founding Fathers discussed, where there are going to be some decisions made over the course of the next 11 or 12 days that could change how we define what a state is for the next 200 years. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Marilinda Garcia.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those comments. My background, I served 4 terms in the state legislature and then also dabbled in federal politics. And I want to just describe what I think the importance of states as labs of democracy and innovation, as it were, is. And that is, it's interesting, I didn't really realize this until I was actively involved as an elected official, and that is that the state governments are by and large a microcosm of what occurs on the federal level, and we all know that in structure, but it's interesting because we grapple with the same issues. We deal with, healthcare, we deal with debt, we deal with education, all of these things. But my philosophy is that government works best when it's closest to the people, because it's then closest to the concerns, to the needs. The elected representatives and officials actually live and work in the communities. They're the neighbors, of the voting populace, if you will. And so I think there's that really a very close connection there, and it just lends itself to better decisions, better consensus in a lot of ways about things that really do directly affect the lives and welfare of the citizens of the state. And so I really appreciate that aspect of state governments. Now, I will say, everybody likes to talk about how divisive and contentious and wild, the politicking can be in federal races. And I will say it's certainly quite dramatic and a little frightening on a large scale, but there's definitely politics at the local level too, and they're not any less vicious in many respects and quite petty. But again, you still have to live with your neighbors, with your elected officials. You're in town together, you're around. So I think it just lends to be to better resolution in a lot of respects. So I want to talk a little about 2 examples, and I mentioned them briefly: healthcare and education, where I really did experience kind of the clash when a state and a group of legislators and industry leaders and citizens are working together on something that really is in the best interest of the particular needs of the state, and then ended up in a situation where the federal government stepped in and made changes that were not in the best interest of the state, but there was really nothing we could do, of course. So in 2009, or actually a little bit before that, we were looking at the long-term health care of our state. And we're a little state. We're pretty homogenous, though we certainly, do have a lot of turnover. Actually, a third of our state in the last decade has moved out and been repopulated by others coming in from surrounding states and other places. But, as with everywhere else, we're interested in growing our economy, creating more jobs, not suffering from the brain drain problem wherein children grow up, perhaps are educated at many of our fine, institutions in the state, but then have to go elsewhere to find a job and raise a family. So when I ran for office, as most other people running for office do, I said, I want to go in there and I want to help create jobs. For me, what did that mean, though? It didn't mean create, of course, larger government and government agencies to then offer more jobs. In that respect, what I meant is I wanted to, through policy, create a more welcoming environment to the growth of various industries. And obviously, the innovation economy and the healthcare sector are areas that are growing and are very important. It's sort of the nexus between science, technology, and medicine. And we had a burgeoning industry in the specialty sector. And I was approached, or actually I was at a conference and I heard about an oncology center that was doing a lot of wonderful work. And they were mentioning that they had a few locations throughout the country and they didn't have one in the Northeast. So I naturally thought, oh, well, that would be fantastic. Maybe they'd be interested in coming to New Hampshire. So I spoke to some of their leadership and invited a business development team over. And they really liked the state. They thought it was, a great opportunity for a place. I've lost a number of family members, 3 of my grandparents actually, to cancer, a young cousin. So I, as most people, I think that, the more options there are for people that are suffering from, this terrible disease, the better. And in our area, we're blessed to be close to the Boston medical area, but again, the more the merrier. So in any case, so they loved it, and they were considering perhaps opening a hospital in New Hampshire, but then they said, we realize that you are one of the 12 states, of the 50 states, that still has a very antiquated regulatory issue that was put in place by the federal government. It's called the Certificate of Need in the 80s, and it was put in place to control costs and prevent overbuilding of hospitals. And they said, and after about a decade, they found it wasn't working out and things were developing a certain way. So it was repealed in most states, but it wasn't in New Hampshire and a number of others. And it basically became a bit of a monopolistic situation wherein the members of the board are populated by hospitals and associations and membership of them, and naturally they are resistant to allowing for competitors to come into the environment. So I got together with a group of citizens, people in healthcare, a number of other elected officials, and we were working on changing that, and then also creating a commission and group to come up with about a 10-year healthcare plan looking forward for our state. And we were making a lot of progress, and there was so much interest, so much great buy-in from citizens and other healthcare organizations. It was really fantastic, and we were successful with the legislation. But unfortunately, around that same time, in 2009, the effects of the healthcare law, the Affordable Care Act, that was put into place, suddenly I noticed right away how everything came to a standstill. And instead of being able to focus on what we knew was needed in our state, what was best for our economy and our citizens and our unique healthcare needs, instead, everybody kind of went back to their silos and said, I really wanted to be involved with this, but now what we're going to have to do is just be sure that we're responding and making the best of our situation, be I in healthcare, be a hospital, be an oncology center, be an insurance company, whatever it is. All of a sudden, everybody went back to their silos, and in the next number of years, we just ended up with everyone having to try to make the best of what the federal government had given us. And frankly, in our state, that meant for example, one district of New Hampshire, which is my congressional district, we have 28 hospitals, and 20 of them were not considered in-network. So it was unbelievable. So we had people that had been with their entire families were going to one doctor, had been having treatment at a certain hospital and suddenly could not go there anymore. It was really quite shocking. So anyway, that's just an example. Things have settled a little bit now, and we've been able to be responsive and make the best of it as we can in our state. But that was just a very real example to me, how I know without a doubt that I much prefer the bottom-up approach where the states can experiment, find ways to, again, best meet the needs of their people, their citizens, and be that in education, healthcare, whatever it is, be the lab of innovation, of trying things out, be responsive to the needs of the people, and then go share that with the other states. And if it works, if you think it's going to work in another one, try it out. But it's easier to be flexible at a small level than it is when you do a one-size-fits-all, I think. So anyway, that's kind of my thought on the states as labs of democracy.
And our last panelist is Robert Inglis.
Except, Paul, if you keep calling me Robert, I think my mom is mad at me. That's what she called me when she was mad at me. Bob is what she called me when she wasn't mad. So, so I don't think she's mad at me. So, but Robert, by the way, does anybody know a Bob? A Bob is a name that's gone out of existence. Have you noticed? There are no Bobs under 40. I once said that to a reporter, sight unseen, and the guy says, I'm 28 or something. I thought, oh, this is not going to go well. But anyway, and it didn't. So anyway, note to self, do not say it sight unseen. But I can see there are no Bobs in here because everybody's got the name. My son has Robert or Rob, But anyhow, so I am looking for a way to affirm that, yes, indeed, we do have these laboratories of democracy, but also to limit that. I think I'm here at the end to limit the role of the states, perhaps, or to indicate how it is that we need, in some cases, a national solution. So, first of all, I got to tell you, I'm very happy that we live. First, I really need to tell you who in the world I am, right? 6 years I was in Congress doing representing the Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina. 6 years out of Congress doing commercial real estate law, and then 6 years back in Congress representing that same district. How many were at Mackey earlier when I was talking there? Did anybody get to hear that? Okay, so some of you heard all that story, so I won't repeat all of that. But the reason that I'm here is to talk mostly about climate change and action that conservatives could take on climate change. So that's our shtick at republican.org, republican.org. And so, but if I could comment on this question, first of all, I think that we really should change the title to Constitutional Republic rather than democracy. The good news is we do not live in a democracy. A democracy, in my opinion, is a pretty poor form of government. If you got more Baptists than Catholics, you can outlaw Mass. That's what you do in a democracy. Thank goodness we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. Don't care how many Baptists you've got, the Catholics are going to have Mass because we have a constitution that protects minority rights. And so it's a very important distinction. It's also important to know it's a representative democracy. I'm embarrassed right now, to tell you the truth, about the Supreme Court non-deliberations by my party. I'm a Republican. Because it's been said that the people need to decide about the Supreme Court justice. No, they don't. Really. Read the Constitution. The idea is that the Senate decides, not the people. Because in a democracy, this is the risk of a democracy, is that you inflame the passions of people for a brief period of time, and the whole idea of a constitutional republic is to not have that happen. So Mr. Adams, John Adams, is rolling in his grave every time this is said on the airwaves, that the people will decide about the Supreme Court justice, because he really didn't want that. That's exactly what he didn't want, because there's a great story when he was down about something, and Abigail said to him, John, according to David McCullough in the book John Adams, John, why are you so down? The people are with you. And he said, yes, Abigail, and a mob is always a mob. That was his view of the risk of a mob. And of course, later he and Mr. Jefferson had great conversations by letter about the difference between the French Revolution and the American War for Independence. Jefferson, who's the father at the university where I went to law school, thought it was great what the French were doing. Mr. Adams thought it was a disaster because it seemed to him a mob. And so thank goodness we live in a constitutional republic, not a democracy. It's a great place to live, and it's also proved very flexible. The part of the Constitution that we're here to talk about, I suppose, is the 10th Amendment, which reserves to the states all powers not delegated to the federal government. And so I agree completely with what Marilinda just said, is that we really want the states to experiment. That's the beauty of the 10th Amendment, is to allow the states this opportunity to experiment and to show how things might work. And of course, then there are times, I suppose, we're seeing with the Puerto Rican situation where the federal government does have to take a role or to figure out how to speak to those kind of situations and take jurisdiction, I suppose, which is a very interesting and legal question that Frank is discussing there. So now that I've commented on their comments, let me just add the one thing that I can add here about the limits of federalism. And a great example, I believe, is climate change. The solution for climate change really, as you heard me earlier, if you were in there, we believe at republicen.org is a revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon tax. And revenue-neutral means cut taxes somewhere else, reduce taxes on income if you're going to do a carbon tax. Border-adjustable means apply it to imports. And that makes it so that the whole world then joins us in pricing carbon dioxide and attaching those costs to the burning of fossil fuels. So then the market can judge those products. At republicen.org, we're real into free enterprise and free markets, and we believe that if you internalize negative externalities, put all the cost in on all the fuels, eliminate all the subsidies, then the free enterprise system can very rapidly deliver innovation. So the reason that's relevant to this panel's discussion, I suppose, is the limit on the ability of the states to do what I just described as that optimal policy. States, of course, pursuant to the Constitution, cannot do a border adjustment. The state of Colorado, for example, could not attach on entry to Colorado a tax on, say, Chinese imports or on imports from California. It doesn't have that power under the Constitution. Only the federal government has the power to impose tariffs. And so that's why this solution, I guess, that we're talking about shows the limits, I suppose, of state experimentation. Now, there are some states that are experimenting. Bless them for going first. We say they're on the bleeding edge because, if you don't have the border adjustment, then you don't have the ability to make it so that the price you're enacting on carbon dioxide is more than just within your state. And so consider this, Illinois, Frank was talking about people with financial troubles. the state of Illinois has huge financial troubles right now, right? And so if Illinois wanted to, they could impose a carbon tax, like what we're talking about, or my friends at Citizens Climate Lobby are talking about. And then they could also make it revenue neutral. They could return the money by a dividend check, or they could do tax cuts. They can make it revenue neutral, but they can't make it border adjustable. And so there are billboards around Chicago that some of you may have seen that say, Illinois yet, move to Wisconsin. And so, so if Illinois did the carbon tax without any border adjustment, of course, those billboards would really go up, and now they'd be saying, Illinois yet move to Indiana or Wisconsin, either one, just move. And so it's very important that if we're going to do what we're talking about doing at republican.org, that we do it at the federal level, so as to make sure that we get China to come along with us and other countries to come along with us as well.
Okay, thank you, panelists. We have some time for panelists to ask each other questions or comment on each other's spoken words.
I'm struck there are some, particularly Bob, some of the things you said, watching, because we're now going through some real experiments of silences and actions with regard to state roles. For instance, I would challenge anyone in this room to tell me what role the state of Missouri has played with regard to the terrible events that occurred in Ferguson. You have a very profound, I think in some cases, inappropriate role by the United States Justice Department and an absolute silence on the part of Missouri. So we have this interesting, and I'm unaware of anything quite like that. We, as everyone in this room is acutely aware, and I know we'll have a panel later this week on the events in Flint. Events where there is primary responsibility really at the state role, where the court there has just said they will allow an impeachment proceeding against Governor Rick Snyder of Michigan. So we're going to see some unique changes and challenges of a constitutional kind taking place there. Beginning next Monday, I would encourage you not, if you're planning on going to Atlantic City and going gaming, don't go next week. The mayor is going to be suspending all but the most essential services for the next 3 weeks because the state's out of money, because the governor, your very favorite governor, has refused to take any action to deal with its impending insolvency. So we are at a time of extraordinary challenges for states, and we're seeing some states like Missouri that have basically said, we have no responsibility whatsoever for something that affects human lives in a municipality. We have the state of Illinois, which is trying to determine, shall we authorize authority for the city of Chicago to be eligible to file for bankruptcy protection. We have the state of Michigan, where the state's actions clearly bear some great responsibility for the likely death of a number of very young children who drank water from the Flint public water system, with a clear awareness on part of some of the people that work for the governor that that water, in fact, contained dangerous levels of lead, particularly for infants. And we have, because of the actions of the governor, in effect you could say the state of New Jersey, essential public services over the next 3 weeks will not be provided because the city can't afford it, and the state has offered no constructive solution to ensure that basic public services that you're used to in Boulder, Colorado, and even in Denver are made available. So I think we're seeing some real hard challenges, and I don't know what they're going to be. So you talked about experimentation. We're going to see it, but we don't have to wait long. And in this case, it's going to involve human health and safety for some of our most vulnerable citizens. You're supposed to now make me feel good.
That was brilliant. I think. Just kidding. No, I think it's very true. And actually, if you dig deep, debt issues are one, of course, but there's a plethora of issues, situations where, in particular states, things really come down to the wire. It's very serious, really affects the quality of life, standard of living, even decisions amongst families and whatnot, if they're even going to stay, in the state. And that is one nice thing, I guess. So you can always move to another state if you don't like what's going on. But I guess, if this is at all analogous in some way, I do think that precedent is a really important concept. And, we've seen this in, for example, the bailout situations. If you can look at companies, in their financial crises, states, then when it goes to another level, for example, I think the root of what helps governments and societies to function is some level of personal responsibility. And when people feel as though power is taken away from them and decision-making potential is taken away from them, and basically that nothing they do can really change their situation for the better, sometimes it's easier to just say, well, we'll see, the government will step in and, this is what's going to happen. And the same way I think states now are in a situation where after the recession, for example, there were all kinds of debt issues to be dealt with. In my state, we're required to have a balanced budget. And because we do not have a state sales tax or income tax, we've always had a strong bond rating, because in the case of an emergency, if you will, that's always considered an emergency measure that could be taken. And we were always pretty responsible. It is, as I said, constitutionally a requirement that we balance the budget. So we had a small budget hole compared to other states to the tune of $800 million. So it was large for us, but it was not large compared to what some of the other states are dealing with. And I think when you just look at the struggles that we had to go through, the measures that we had to take, cuts and efficiencies we had to find and whatnot, I think it really gave us an opportunity to, again, pull together, do what was best for us. And so it's interesting when you're, talking about Puerto Rico and the situations that could come to bear in Illinois and other states. You do wonder, when is the point when everyone will just throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we can't do it anymore, help us out, federal government. And then what precedent does that set for other states in years to come? I guess that remains to be seen, but is a bit concerning.
Bob, would you like to comment?
Well, I'm interested in a little bit of audience participation. When I mentioned the 10th Amendment earlier, I'm going to read it and just see whether if you were there drafting the Constitution, would you have it in or an out? It'd just be interesting to see. What it says is, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So in other words, the powers not delegated to the federal government are left to the states. So you can have an expansive view of the 10th Amendment or a very restrictive view of the 10th Amendment. The restrictive view would be, well, listen, it's, in other words, take real license with what may have been granted to the federal government. The federal government grows that way. The very restrictive view of the 10th Amendment is to say that confuse those two adjectives, I think. You can either be very strong on the 10th Amendment and say the 10th Amendment keeps the federal government in a box, a very defined box of what it can do. A looser interpretation of the 10th Amendment says, no, it's fine to do things at the federal level that weren't envisioned by the framers. So I'm just curious, do you, raise your hand if you're like a strict constructionist. Do you think that the 10th Amendment should be strictly construed and that the federal government should be in that box? And how many think that it should be out of the box and it's okay with you if it does other things? Interesting. So that's, it's a big debate right now in a lot of very red districts in this nation. I represented perhaps the reddest district and the reddest state in the nation, Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina. I don't know, anybody thinks they can compete with Greenville-Spartanburg as a very red district? I don't think so. As I said earlier, as folks heard me say, I don't think not Boulder. Boulder cannot compete. I'm sorry, you are not going to win that competition with us in Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina. So we're a pretty red place, and we really talk a lot about the 10th Amendment. And that's it's something that's important to people in those very red places. So it's interesting to see what you think about the 10th Amendment. I'm pretty strict constructionist myself. Oh, there were 4 of us for strict construction, and the rest of everybody here was for a looser interpretation of the 10th Amendment. So the 4 of us are strong. I'm signing up Republicans right here, republicen.org.
I think Frank has a question for Bob.
So I'm very interested. We've talked really about the role of states, and we've talked about the federal government, but you're dealing with climate change. Mm-hmm. And when I think about climate change, I think about land use, zoning, rights of way. These are small issues in Boulder, Colorado, right? I'm just interested in your thing, because the issues you care about a lot are really local issues. Yep. And it's something state legislatures generally are not, shall we say, generous with giving power to local governments.
Right.
So I'd be really interested, particularly looking at your neighbor, North Carolina, right now.
Yeah, yes. You have an issue going. Yeah, yes. You read in the newspaper. Yeah. It's, in climate change, we deal with adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation is what we at Republican are doing. We're trying to head it off, to mitigate the impacts of climate change. That means, get CO2 emissions down, other greenhouse gases, fewer of those being released, right? That's mitigation. Adaptation is where you build seawalls in Manhattan and pump stations in Miami. That adaptation is clearly a local matter that is very helpful to driving the conversation at the federal level, though, about mitigating, right? Because I happen to think it'd be very helpful if Manhattan were to be putting up a seawall or something, because it would help people to understand the issue, that this is where it's coming to. And I was just down in Florida last week, and the mayors in South Florida are doing some great work that's helping people to see that it's not about whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're a liberal or a conservative. The sea is just rising, and it's coming up through the ground in Miami. It's not like it's just coming in through a wave. Miami is built on limestone, as you know, and so it's essentially a sponge. There's no way to keep the water out. It's not like you can build levees and dikes. It just comes up into your yard. It's on the streets. It's coming through the storm sewers. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a Republican driver or a Democrat driver. If you drive your car through that salt water, if you don't know about salt water, I'll tell you, if you drop your outboard motor in salt water like I have growing up at the coast in South Carolina, that motor is done. And so it's a very serious matter to drive a car through salt water. And so on the used market. See, you get practical advice here. Don't buy a used car if it's been driven through salt water. The point being that that we, trying to affect national policy, and in fact really get the whole world to come to this policy through the border adjustment that I was talking about, can be benefited in the political discussion by local action by mayors, because that action helps people to see what's going on, and gets them to pay attention to the issue. We all like to think we're very rational and that we make decisions based on facts. I think that's really a myth. We're all emotional, thank goodness, and we make emotional decisions. The heart decides and the head justifies. And so if the heart tells us that we're about to lose a homeland, another homeland, and you're a Cuban American, we found that in polling data, the Cuban American women are particularly concerned about climate change. Our theory is it has to do with losing another homeland. And that gets you in the heart, and then you start looking in the head for solutions. So the mayors, by organizing people and getting people to focus on adaptation, actually help us in the mitigation front, because they help us cause people to get interested in the issue and get their hearts going so their heads can conceive it.
I really, if I can jump in on that one, I appreciate that, Bob, because I think one of the frustrations that we all have with politics and really what's supposed to be discussion and debate, and I don't think necessarily is a lot on the federal level, is that it seems like every argument becomes so marginal. It's either you're for or against it, and it's, an argument on the extremes of each side. It's very marginal, when really, if we all had a community focus, if we all were introduced to these issues in ways that, again, we could see, touch, feel, understand, experience, I think we would so much more be able to understand what are the common sense things that can be done, where we have the common ground that's, frankly, there's so much of in between these marginal arguments we have. But I guess in the world of the 30-second soundbite and the inclination of everyone, be it media and also, I think, people looking at different candidates, that they always want to put someone in a box so they can know, how they can identify them, what, label they can have on them, and then therefore, so we can decide if we're for them or against them. And there really isn't that room for, I think, what's a much more human and real understanding of these issues. So.
One last comment, and then we're going to turn questions over to you.
I think it would be good to close this part by talking really about fundamental roles of states. If you think about it, since Congress first enacted the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, Congress has reduced federal funding for those two programs by 96%. So they held a hearing 2 weeks ago. It was basically a hearing to blame the events in Flint, Michigan, on the city of Flint and the state of Michigan. It's the only purpose of the hearing, is to blame people. They blamed a Republican governor. They blamed a Democratic mayor of Flint. They blamed a former emergency manager of Flint. No one on that committee said, our role in the Congress is to explore whether the federal government contributed to that crisis, if so, how, whether there are solutions, constructive, positive solutions to help. The only role of Congress seems to be, let's find out who we can blame. That's really not an option if you're a member of a state legislature, if you're a governor, if you're a mayor, if you're a council member. If you are the new mayor, Mayor Sawyer in Flint, you know you've got to deal with it. You don't want a child to die. You will do whatever it takes. You know the governor now is acutely aware that the federal government could care less. Its only role is to serve as a level of government that will harshly criticize whatever is done. It will play no constructive role, not add a dollar. So on your resume is how many children over the next 10 years that are under 2 in Flint today are going to die because of government's failure in Flint. So there are profound differences emerging. The role of the Congress has sort of ceased to be a constructive part of what affects you in your day-to-day life. And that is something that imbues to the state and, of course, especially to local governments.
And Paul, can I add something to that? See, Frank's got me going now. It's a good way to pitch to the audience, perhaps, is I happen to think that, we love to blame the Congress for the gridlock. But actually, it's really us that's the reason for the gridlock. People who get involved in campaigns are activists on the far left and activists on the far right. That's who gives energy to campaigns. And so there are a lot of people that are sort of somewhere short of those extremes that aren't involved in campaigns. And so as a result, the political process goes to the extremes. And the politicians are just doing what you would expect them to do to cater to that, to harness that energy on the far left and the far right. It's happening right now in the presidential race. And so there's this whole unexplored solutionville in the middle. And the problem, and maybe somebody here can help me find better language in calling it the middle, because the middle means mushy moderate. And Rush Limbaugh goes around saying, and he's right in this, not right on some things, but he's right on this, there are no monuments to mushy moderates. The monuments are to people who took bold positions. There are no monuments to mushy moderates. And so the key is not to mush into the middle, but to come with your passions into the middle, seeking solutions and the goodwill of other people. In other words, for the conservative to enter the fray, the discussion, not abandoning their conservative principles, but saying, we see you want a solution on climate change, you on the environmental left. We think your solution doesn't work. It's called the Clean Power Plan. It doesn't work. So we'll show you a better way. And now let's debate whether that is a better way and whether we can cooperate or really collaborate on how to fix it. So I guess what prompted me was just, it's maybe too easy to blame members of Congress for the faults. I mean, this is a guy talking to you who got tossed out of Congress by somebody that was using these kind of forces. But still, we shouldn't blame members of Congress. They generally do exactly what we want them to do. We tell them to go up there and talk about balancing the budget, but don't touch our Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or defense if you're a conservative. Don't touch any of those 4 things. And so they say, right, got it. You want us to go up there and talk and do nothing. We're really pretty good at that. And so, and on climate change, many of us say, oh yes, go up there and do something, talk about it. But then when it gets to 25 cents per gallon increase in the price of gasoline or 1 to 2 cents per kilowatt hour increase in the price of electricity, we say, wait a minute, time out, hold on. We want you to just talk, not do anything. So what we have to do is rise to full citizenship and say, yes, we're ready for the adult conversation. Don't talk to us about foreign aid as a way to balance the budget. It's less than 1% of the money we spend. Talk to us about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. And now let's talk. And let's have an adult conversation, right? And when we get to that place where many people are in the solutionville, not in the extremes, but in solutionville, looking for those solutions, then we can move forward. But they will respond when we give them those marching orders. Up until then, they'll keep on talking. Sort of like me now.
Let's take your questions. We have a microphone over here on your right. if you want to just come up and ask your questions. We do encourage students to come on up. We'll give students priority. And we do have one text question, but we'll do that question after our first questioner. So yes, one caveat, one question per person, no speeches, please.
Understand how the 10th Amendment equally applies to all citizens of the United States when we have the District of Columbia, when they do not get the same representation. Thus, I cannot be a strict constructionist. Can I get an answer to that?
Frank, you have an answer for that?
No, I can't give you a full answer. We spent a lot of years in the delegation of the representatives from the Washington metropolitan area trying to get that. And I don't know, and I would have to ask the congressman his perspective. Our perspective is there was a plantation mentality, and it came down to, are you going to grant a vote that will, without question, be a Democratic vote, and not a moderate or a conservative Democratic vote, a liberal Democratic vote. So I don't see it happening anytime in the near future. I can say the other change that's really unfortunate for the district is back when I worked for a congresswoman from an adjacent district, we met at a staff level and a member level once a month to ask the question, what's in the best interest for the greater Washington metropolitan area, with Washington, D.C. being at the heart of it. When I went back as a chief of staff for a member of Congress from the region 6 years ago, I tried to get my colleagues and the members from the region to meet once a month to talk about the best interests of the metropolitan region. I have to confess that in 2 years I was unable to get a single meeting. So some of it is that change that's really occurred in the Congress, that sort of destructive rather than constructive thinking, how do we make tomorrow better? It's now almost more, how can I find a way to blame someone else for something that's bad, rather than what is it I can do to help change to make something more constructive looking forward?
Next question.
Yes. Can cities also be laboratories of democracy? Representative Garcia said that governments work best when they're closest to the people, and it seems like cities are even closer than legislators. I'm from Arizona, and the governor and state legislators are trying to attack city governments from having minimum wage laws and other type laws like that. So they're trying to not have local control by the city governments, but argue we should have local control by the state governments. Could you address that contradiction?
I definitely think that there are a lot of stressors, right? And if I don't know if this applies so much in your the particular city you're talking about and whatnot, but there are certain states, for example, and I think this is a problem in the electoral process as well, wherein you can almost say that the state and then their largest city are almost at odds as well, in terms of, for example, take Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania. Take what would another one be? Even what's that? Sure, New York. So I do think when I was looking at it, I was, we have state constitutions and we have the different chambers, the House, the Senate, the government. So I was making that comparison more. I think there is some truth, yes. There should be autonomy in some respects in different cities, in cities and local municipalities and whatnot, because I think it's still true that they best understand, the needs. But I think that's a small enough, within the state is a small enough area that you shouldn't necessarily cede all of that autonomy to a city when it's working within, the state as it is. Then you end up with a situation like where I lived for a few years, the People's Republic of Cambridge, for example, in Massachusetts, where they, they have all sorts of interesting things going on. But so I would bend my prescription, if you will, and not include cities so much. I would say where there's a analogous form of government within House, Senate, and executive office.
I would significantly disagree. I think you're going to find the most interesting case I can think of is we have in Boulder, we have all across the country something called Airbnb. And when Airbnb came in my state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, the governor and the legislature immediately said, we'll handle that issue. But Airbnb provides facilities for families and people to stay, whether in Boulder or anywhere else. It deals with essential issues involving land use, noise ordinances, parking, local lodging taxes. I had one of my students, I said, before we do this guidebook, you need to meet with one of your elected officials. In Virginia, on average, local elected officials they don't know what an app is. So if we're going to do a guidebook, it's really important to make sure we know, for the people for whom you're writing this guidebook, where they're coming from. So before we start, you're to meet with an elected official from your local government. So one student said, well, my local elected official said there are no Airbnb facilities in Loudoun County, Virginia. I said, so what did you do? She said, I looked at my iPhone underneath the table. There were 1,791 Airbnb facilities. I said, so what did you do? She said, excuse me, supervisor, but there are nearly 1,800 facilities. And it matters to you because in some cases there will be multiple cars blocking people from getting out of their driveways, and they will call City Hall or they'll call the county and they'll complain. The people that own lodgings, inns, and hotels will say, how come we're paying taxes to the county, but you're not? So there you have a peculiarly local issue. You can imagine, though, then the big issue was the Commonwealth of Virginia, the legislation and the governor going to preempt the authority of counties and cities to control, to tax Airbnb. And it was a monumental fight, only decided on the final day of the legislature. So it's interesting watching the development of Uber, which involves transportation, which crosses states and crosses state lines. And the Virginia Municipal League and the Virginia Association of Counties agreed to cede authority to the state because they understood that that's something that in a real sense is not local. But the knockdown, drag-out fight ended on the final day of the legislature with the legislature finally conceding housing and lodging issues are essentially local. They're not state issues, and we are going to defer for the greatest part to each local government to decide how they want to deal with this issue that's growing everywhere.
Okay. We have a related text question that kicks it up a level. The question is, isn't it hard for states to be laboratories when the federal government has the money?
Yeah, it's, yes. I mean, particularly if it's like, if you're talking about the gas tax, for example, the idea there is, of course, to figure out a way that people traveling, say, your interstates here in Colorado that aren't residents of Colorado can pay for that. And of course, we do that through the gas tax. So states need that money in order to make their roads work. But yeah, so the federal government has the money. The opposite of that, of course, is unfunded federal mandates where the federal government doesn't have the money but tells the states or localities what to do. That's when you get really insulting as a federal legislator and talking to state and local officials is when you start telling them what to do, but don't give them the money to do it. So I guess it's both sides of that are, in some cases the federal government has the money, in other cases they have the idea, but no money, but just tell you to do it.
Right.
I think there's a second part to this answer also, and that is, you might call it budget envy. The city of Boulder, the state of Colorado is required to balance its budget, which it does every year. The federal government does not balance its budget. So, you know, the lectures from Congress about fiscal responsibility fall on pretty deaf ears, because I think there's been 1 year in the last 20 the federal government has actually balanced the budget, and there's no remote chance in the near future the federal government will come anywhere close to balancing the budget. The biggest single part of the federal budget and the federal deficit and the national debt today is tax expenditures. It's the fastest growing part of the federal budget. And Congress already this year, of course, has acted on a huge bill that will increase the debt and the deficit by leaps and bounds. In tax breaks, mostly something like 84% of those will go only to those of you in this room who earn in excess of $1 million a year, which I realize restricts it to about 97% of you. But so you can see, if you're a member of a state legislature, or you're a former member, or you're a member of a city council, you have to make really hard choices every year. Okay, am I going to increase taxes to balance the budget? Am I going to increase the size of classes in schools? What am I going to do? Because I have to make that decision. But in Congress, you don't make that decision. You don't have to. You just say, well, we do it every year, we're responsible. But it is a rare miracle indeed in any year over the last 50 years that Congress has actually balanced a budget.
Well, and I would just add to that, it's actually quite insidious the way it works. I served on the finance committee for 2 terms, and we pride ourselves on having a rather transparent process. We go through the budget section by section, agency by agency. All the commissioners have to come forward, and we go line by line, through their budgets and say, okay, how's this doing? Explain to me why you have this many people doing this and this many this. How's the new computer system, etc. And they really have to justify as well as they can every dollar, and we are required to balance the budget. So, but you will end up in these situations where you'll hear your colleagues or people saying, well, this program isn't working so well, and we actually don't really know, in one scenario, or in another scenario, we don't necessarily need this, but if we don't implement it, we won't get the federal money, and it's just like, we'll take it, And then once you go down that road, then the next time around, try to repeal it or take it away. It's not going to happen, because now there's a job tied to that. There's some sort of service tied to that. There may not be outcomes, that are showing positive work in whatever area it is, but it almost doesn't matter. Once it's there, it's very hard to move it back, and that's why things grow and grow and grow, and I think we're in the situation we're in.
Let's take a question from a student. Are you a student? Okay, then you get to ask the question.
Okay, I'm intrigued by the phenomenon of state and local politics being focused more on partisan interests and less on parochial interests. And so I wonder if this is a good thing democratically, just as the American Political Science Association recommended we needed more polarization so that voters had more choice in terms of political representation. Now that we have more divergent partisan politics within states, that voters will have a bigger choice. But I also want to ask, what negative consequences do you anticipate when we start to see gridlock in states that resembles federal government gridlock?
I'll just quickly respond. Number one, I think when it comes to the states, it is kind of interesting. I think because of sort of that community focus, like as I was saying earlier, and I feel like I keep bringing that up, so apologize if I'm being redundant, but you'll find when you look at election results, actually my state is a perfect example of this. You can end up with a supermajority of one party or the other in the state legislature, and then a completely different results in one of your congressmen, for example, in the same district. So you'll end up with one party here, the other party there. You'll end up with a governor's office, even in years where there's a sweep, you know, in both other chambers of one party or the other, because of reasons of either personality or just general sense of, you know, how the governor's doing or what kind of person he or she is. They can stay in office even though their entire party is not represented in the other two chambers. And I think overall, though, again, you have more of a motivation to find consensus and to make policy decisions that need to be made and do affect people's lives quite directly. And then the other thing I would just say is that I think we talk about gridlock as though it's a bad thing, but in fact, it's not necessarily. I mean, obviously we have a system and, you know, you hear about checks and balances all the time, but when we've been talking about our debt and deficit, well, the only years that we actually didn't grow our debt and deficit on the federal level were when we had gridlock, because when one party has the presidency and the House and the Senate, however, you know, whichever party it is, you'll see it grow, grow, grow. This happened under both Republican and Democrat presidents in the last, 30 years, 20 years maybe. And the only time that we saw a reduction was when we had gridlock. So maybe it's not such a bad thing, especially if we're considering, and I think it's true, that we have a very, you know, partisan and, as he was saying, very marginal system where the extremes and the, you know, activism on both sides, which I hate to discourage, by the way, but when you have the extremes kind of pushing the political agenda, maybe it's not a bad thing that one party can't run roughshod with an agenda over the rest of the country. So I don't think gridlock is always that bad.
I want to answer your question in a slightly different way. On the night before Detroit went bankrupt, the emergency manager sent out an email to every single employee of the city of Detroit, informing them to make sure they reported to work the next day, that the critical issue was to make sure that if there was a 911 call, there would be a response, that lights were on so people driving could see, that the water worked, the toilets worked. What really distinguishes cities and counties versus states and the federal government is if you dial 911, the system better work. The day the Pentagon was attacked, it was a deputy fire chief that was in command of all federal and state forces that responded, was there 2 minutes after that plane hit the Pentagon. So when it comes to saving human lives and making sure the electricity works, the water works, things that are fundamental to human health and safety, it's all at the local level. So you can't have this gridlock and say, we're going to go home, we're going to recess, we'll come some other time. It absolutely has to work.
Okay, we are running a little short on time. I want to take one question from over. Okay. Who has been waiting the longest? I think she has. And so we'll take one over here and then one over here.
And thank you all for being here. My mind is spinning with questions, but I'm very interested in what goes on in the Supreme Court and the issue of Puerto Rico. They've known they were in trouble for a long time. My pet peeve is people not taking responsibility and sort of passing the buck. Did the Puerto Rican people do anything to promote business maybe from the mainland into Puerto Rico? Or has our government done anything to help facilitate maybe businesses there and in helping the country so they wouldn't be in this situation?
Our government has done things that have aggravated the situation, number one. Number two, because of what's been happening in the economy, young people, young bright people that have done well, have chosen to move to New York and Florida in droves if they're highly educated because they think they have better opportunities. So what's really been happening in Puerto Rico is the average age has increased significantly, and the percentage of the population, which today is close to 43%, are in poverty. So it has statistics that are worse than any of the states. So you have a combination of what I would call adverse treatment by the federal government, treating Puerto Rico in some cases worse than other non-US countries in the Caribbean. And then you have these terrible issues where the young people, realizing there's not a great future for Puerto Rico, are moving mostly to New York, mostly to Florida. And these are the young bright people who would be critical for the future of Puerto Rico. So it's a tragedy. I think that I got an email from a good friend of mine yesterday. He said, it's a tragedy, and the behavior of the governor of Puerto Rico today is making it worse because the desire is to try and blame rather than take responsibility and try and come up with a solution. But I believe it's well past the point they can do it themselves, and there's going to have to be some constructive federal role, and we're working now almost around the clock to try and make that happen.
One last question.
This may be some of a segue, but I hope it's relevant. And particularly, I'm responding to Bob Inglis's presentation of us in terms of being out there, either left or right. But there's been no discussion about the role of lobbyists, both at the very local and and I wonder if you'd speak to that in terms of your concerns.
Well, of course, the right to petition the government is guaranteed by the Constitution. So it's this pesky Constitution that keeps these people in business, so the Constitution says you have the right to petition the government. And so if you and I are in business, we have the right to speak through, say, our lawyer or our vice president that we send to the Capitol Hill to talk. And that's surely something we don't want to mess with, right? We want people to be able to approach their government, petition their government for whatever need they have or desire they have. The thing that's where it gets a little bit funny, not funny, where it gets problematic is all the buying and selling of influence in large dollars. I guess I saw that in my own measuring life. I will tell you this: when I got back to Congress in the second go-round, the beginning of the second go-round, the chief of staff that I had in the first go-round was helping me set up the office again, and so he showed me over lunch. He said, "Now this is the price list. If you want on that committee, the price this is what it cost," and the numbers were all six figures. So if you wanted a seat on this committee, it was $250,000, $350,000, $400,000. If you wanted a gavel, committee chairman gavel, subcommittees were sort of like $500,000. The full committee was $1 million if you were, and so what you have to do is you have to go gather up campaign contributions so that then you have in your account the ability to fork that money over to the party, which is pretty alarming, I would imagine, to most people sitting here, isn't it? It's very alarming. Yeah, the idea was, that's how the party allocates those chairmanships and those committee slots, and so it was interesting that I knew then that we were in trouble in my party, and I had a joke going with. Turned out to be not much of a joke, with a Democrat friend. I used to tell him on the House floor when we were doing really some things that were obviously designed to throw attention off of the current news cycle. As you recall, back then, Majority Leader Tom DeLay was having some real troubles. I used to tell my friend from Chicago Democrat, I said, remember me when you come into your majority, okay? And of course, they did come into their majority because our party had really messed up in those ways. And it had particularly to do with the corrosive influence of getting to the very crass place of saying, this is the price list. And so now how do you fix that? Well, you got another pesky part of the Constitution, the First Amendment. This Constitution is just pesky because it has a right to free speech. And the court has ruled essentially, I think Frank would agree with this, that speech includes the right to make political contributions. And so it's really a hard thing to deal with, isn't it? Whereas, for example, a country like the UK does not have this problem, right? They limit political advertising to a certain period of time. You cannot be on the airwaves up until that time. Well, you can do that if you're the UK because you don't have a constitution and you don't have a First Amendment to the Constitution. So that's our reality that we're dealing with, right? I'm not really answering your question. I guess I will say this, though. Way too much attention to that being the only problem we've got. It is not going to answer all the problems we've got to just deal with the campaign cash situation, particularly when it comes to the issue that I'm working on in my day job of climate change. It's not explained totally by campaign cash. It's somewhat explained, but it is not the controlling factor. The controlling factor is more just the heart rejection of the idea of needing to do something about climate change. That's the bigger thing, because the campaign cash would follow after that. And some people that are opposed, that are currently making a living off of polluting the air, would find themselves out of luck with the public. And that would turn quickly. They would not have as much campaign cash anymore to spend because they'd be out of business. So campaign cash explains part of our paralysis, but not all of it, in other words.
It also explains dysfunction. The last time I worked in the House, the chiefs of staff for Democrats met every Monday morning in the basement of the Capitol. That day we had the surface transportation bill coming to the floor of the House for a vote. They had done a really poor job in the Committee of Jurisdiction, and the poor job meant that there was not $1 for the state of California or the state of Virginia. And I raised my hand in this meeting. I said, can we stop talking about how much money each of our members has raised? Because we've got legislation coming to the floor of the House for a vote today, and it has a huge problem. It doesn't send $1 to the state my boss represents, the Commonwealth of Virginia, nor does it send $1 to the state of California. They said, we don't have time for that. So that's kind of the state where we're reaching in the Congress, that how much, it's really what Bob said, how much money did your boss raise for our party, whether it's the Republican or the Democratic Party, rather than how do we make sure what we're doing works for the people of Louisiana or California or New Hampshire? It's a horrible state. And every Monday morning I got a call from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Hey, your boss has not met his limit for how much he's given to the party this week. And I finally realized my job here is apparently supposed to be raising campaign cash instead of governing and helping the people of Virginia that elected my boss. It's a bad thing.
Can I just say, I do think it's definitely a big problem on the inside track because of the influence peddling, which affects not only actual policies and what occurs, but also the motivations. So people that might arrive in Congress with the best of intentions find themselves in a scramble to just raise money. That way they will have more power, and that way potentially be able to do some of the things they promised, but in fact then they end up looking just towards their next election and not accomplishing a lot. But I also think it's destructive on the front end in terms of encouraging active citizenship when people are considering running for office or not. I will tell you, I ran for Congress in New Hampshire, small state, right? Tiny state, 2 congressional districts. And one of my major points of reticence was, can I raise millions of dollars? You know, how am I going to do that? And in fact, I ended up raising $1.5 million. This was not nearly enough, and I was running against an incumbent, you know, from the other party, who happened to be only notable in that she was the most prolific fundraiser in Congress for her party and hadn't really accomplished much else, but she certainly had a huge war chest. But in any case, you know, it's only getting higher. President Obama brought us to $1 billion presidential campaign. I don't know what's happening, you know, this November. Well, I'm sure it's only going to go up. But the fact that someone wanting to run for Congress in one of the smallest states in the country, in one congressional district, that you would have to actually raise millions of dollars, I think that's a problem. I think it's really a problem. And it kind of changes the types of people that you have running, you know, those who have means, have resources, are wealthy, are retired. I don't know, you know, it's just, you can't do it just because you care and you want to do something to help your country, if you will. That's unfortunately not enough.
Okay, we unfortunately have to wrap it up. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the texters. I want to thank you for your questions. There was one suggestion from a texter that we rename the Mushing Middle the Collaborative Center. Not a bad idea. Thank you very much.